You might not know his name, but you've probably seen Richard Jaeckel's face dozens of times. He appeared in war movies, Western films, police shows, and even beach lifeguard series. When Hollywood needed someone who looked tough and believable, they called him. He wasn't a romantic leading man or a movie star heartthrob, but he was something more important. He was real. For more than 50 years, he helped create the movies and TV shows that shaped what American toughness looked like on screen. But then, slowly and quietly, he disappeared from view. Not because of any scandal or controversy, but through something much more painful. He was simply forgotten. Richard Jaeckel's story shows us what true dedication looks like. He never strutted down red carpets wearing sunglasses and acting like a superstar. Instead, he was the soldier crouched in a muddy trench, holding his rifle and making every moment feel completely real. His career included standout performances in movies like Guadalcanal Diary, The Dirty Dozen, and Sometimes a Great Notion. He put everything he had into every single role. Despite his hard work, his many accomplishments, and even getting nominated for an Academy Award, Jaeckel never became an A-list celebrity. The sad truth is that Hollywood never planned to make him one. For decades, he worked without stopping, appearing in more than 150 movies and television shows. His life was devoted to acting itself, not to becoming famous. He didn't play the celebrity game or try to get his name in the headlines. Eventually, Hollywood moved on without him. When his time came to an end, there were no big celebrations or special television tributes, just a quiet goodbye to a man who had helped build the foundation of classic American movies. What happened to Richard Jaeckel in his final years is both surprising and heartbreaking. This isn't a story about someone who failed in their career. Instead, it's about someone who quietly devoted himself to his work, only to be cruelly neglected by the industry he served so faithfully. Richard Jaeckel wasn't born into the movie business or raised with dreams of stardom. He came into the world in 1926 in Long Beach, New York, and moved with his family to Los Angeles when he was young. There, in the shadow of the famous Hollywood sign, his life took an unexpected turn. He wasn't trying to break into acting at all. In fact, he was working a regular job as a mail delivery boy at 20th Century Fox when everything changed for him. At just 17 years old, with no acting experience and no connections in the business, he was chosen for a role in Guadalcanal Diary, a major war film that came out in 1943. This single role launched him into a career that would last over 50 years. Right from the beginning, he was different from other actors. Jaeckel had something you couldn't fake, a genuine toughness. His roles were never flashy or showy, but they always left an impression on viewers. He looked like someone who had actually lived through the experiences his characters faced, and he could make even the smallest parts memorable. He brought a real intensity to the screen that came from somewhere deep inside him. Both critics and casting directors recognized this special quality. Jaeckel was the type of actor who made everyone around him perform better. He wasn't loud or attention-seeking. He was simply very good at what he did. But behind his tough on-screen presence was actually a gentle, kind, and deeply loyal person. People who worked with him described him as quiet, humble, and completely professional. He never tried to steal attention from others, and he never acted like he was more important than anyone else. On movie sets, he always showed up on time, knew exactly where he was supposed to stand, and treated everyone with respect, from the directors to the production assistants. However, this humble attitude may have actually worked against him in a town that often rewards people who are bold and boastful. While other actors chased magazine covers and expensive contracts, Jaeckel was simply happy to have work. He loved acting for what it was, not as a path to stardom, but as a skill worth mastering perfectly. This dedication showed in every role he played. Whether he was portraying a battle-hardened soldier or a small-town police officer, there was always something deeper happening beneath the surface of his performance. Still, even with strong work and the respect of his fellow actors, the spotlight always seemed to stay just out of his reach. It was as if Hollywood could never quite figure out what to do with a man who was both a tough guy and a tender soul. But as the years went by, Jaeckel would prove that he was much more than just a reliable supporting actor. He was a fighter both on-screen and in real life, and soon he would face some of the most difficult challenges of his career. By the time the 1960s arrived, Richard Jaeckel had built a solid reputation for himself. He wasn't a box office star who could guarantee ticket sales, but he was a respected character actor who brought depth to every role he took on. He was the kind of actor that producers trusted to deliver excellent work, no matter how difficult the part might be. His biggest break came in 1967 with The Dirty Dozen, a brutal and unforgettable World War II action film that featured some of the biggest names in Hollywood. Even surrounded by a cast full of major stars, Jaeckel stood out. He might not have been the flashiest actor in the group, but he was definitely the most believable. And that authenticity never went unnoticed by audiences or critics. But it wasn't just action scenes with explosions and machine guns that showed what Jaeckel could really do as an actor. In 1971, he gave a powerful and emotionally raw performance in Sometimes a Great Notion, playing a rough logger who was emotionally fragile underneath his tough exterior. His work in this film earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. This was the highest point of his critical recognition and should have marked the beginning of an exciting new chapter in his career. But even with an Oscar nomination to his name, the phone didn't start ringing constantly with new opportunities. There were no glamorous leading roles or million-dollar contracts waiting for him. Instead, he went back to the same kind of work he had always done, taking on tough, understated roles that didn't get much attention. This was a harsh reminder of how Hollywood treated actors like Jaeckel. The industry valued their skill and reliability, but rarely celebrated them properly. Despite all his hard work and obvious talent, the system never quite knew how to reward him appropriately. As newer, more glamorous faces filled movie screens, his quiet strength began to be overlooked. Behind the scenes, this treatment took an emotional toll on him. Jaeckel wasn't the type of person to complain publicly about his situation. He was a working man through and through, committed to doing his job well. But people close to him said there were moments when his frustration showed. He watched as other actors with less talent but more charm and marketing appeal rose to the top of the industry. He saw Hollywood shift away from the character-driven stories he loved toward special effects-driven blockbusters that focused more on spectacle than storytelling. Through all these changes, he kept showing up and doing the work. No matter how small the role was or how far he had fallen from being center stage, he maintained his professionalism and dedication. The battle happening off-screen was just as intense as the ones he fought in his movie roles. It was a battle for relevance, for respect, and for a sense of purpose in his work. Although he rarely showed it publicly, these struggles left emotional scars that would only deepen as he entered the next phase of his career, a phase filled with perseverance, but also quiet heartbreak. Despite everything working against him, Richard Jaeckel never gave up on his craft, but Hollywood was already beginning to forget about him. Richard Jaeckel was never the kind of actor who believed in slowing down or taking long breaks. While other actors took extended vacations between projects or retired from the business entirely, Jaeckel kept working steadily. From the 1940s all the way into the 1990s, he rarely let more than a few months pass without stepping onto a movie or television set. His resume grew longer every single year, eventually including more than 150 film and television credits. For most actors, even half that number would represent a dream career. For Jaeckel, it was simply the life he had chosen and committed to. Even as the film industry evolved and changed around him, he adapted to new circumstances. During the 1980s and early 1990s, he became a familiar face on television, appearing in popular shows like Baywatch, Starman, and Spencer for Hire. He wasn't playing the lead character, but he was often the best thing about any episode he appeared in. Viewers might not have known his name, but they trusted his face completely. When Richard Jaeckel showed up on screen, audiences knew they were about to see something real and authentic. But behind his tireless work ethic was a man who was running low on options in his career. As Hollywood increasingly chased younger, trendier talent, his phone began ringing less and less frequently. His roles became progressively smaller, background characters, brief guest appearances, or tough guys with just a few lines of dialogue. There were no more Oscar-caliber roles being offered to him. Still, he approached each part with complete seriousness, giving the same level of intensity and dedication that he had always brought to his work. Then, in the early 1990s, something began to change in a way that had nothing to do with his career. The sharpness in his eyes began to fade. He started missing important phone calls, forgetting his lines during filming, and losing weight noticeably. At first, these changes were subtle, but the people around him began to worry about his health. By 1994, he received the devastating news that he had been officially diagnosed with terminal cancer. With that diagnosis came the cruelest twist of all. He could no longer continue working. For a man whose entire identity had always been tied to his craft and his work, stepping away from acting felt like watching his life collapse in slow motion. There was no farewell tour, no magazine covers featuring his story, and no final tearful interviews with entertainment reporters. His exit from the industry was as quiet as his entry had been more than 50 years earlier. One day he was a familiar face that audiences could count on seeing on their screens. The next day he was gone from public view. That was when his real struggle began, because if Hollywood had neglected to properly recognize him during his most productive years, what happened next would be even more difficult to accept. By the mid-1990s, Richard Jaeckel's body was beginning to fail him, but his spirit remained strong and unbroken. After a lifetime of grueling work schedules, long days on movie sets, and relentless performances that demanded everything he had to give, his final fight would be the most devastating and personal challenge he had ever faced. In 1996, Jaeckel received the official diagnosis that his cancer was terminal. He was 7 years old. The disease began taking over his body quickly, stripping away the energy and physical strength that had defined him for so many decades. His acting career, which had sustained and defined him for over 50 years, came to an abrupt and final halt. Just like that, the industry he had dedicated his entire adult life to seemed to forget that he had ever existed. But the real shock came when the harsh financial reality of his situation became clear. Despite his lengthy career and hundreds of acting credits, Richard Jaeckel did not have the kind of money that people might have expected. His medical bills were mounting rapidly, and his family, who were already emotionally overwhelmed by his illness, suddenly found themselves facing an impossible financial burden. The man who had appeared in scenes alongside legends like John Wayne and Clint Eastwood was now being moved into a motion picture and television fund home, a facility specifically for industry veterans who needed financial assistance. There were no red carpet fundraising events organized on his behalf, no public statements of support from major movie studios, and no celebrity friends stepping forward to help publicly. There was just silence, the same silence that had followed him as his roles became smaller and his name gradually slipped from public awareness. It was a bitter reminder that in Hollywood, loyalty to the industry doesn't guarantee that the industry will be loyal to you in return. Working-class actors, no matter how prolific or skilled they might be, are rarely remembered or supported when the spotlight fades and they're no longer useful. But Jaeckel's story didn't end in complete darkness. When fans and former colleagues heard about what was happening to him, many were genuinely stunned. A grassroots wave of support began to develop organically. Donations started trickling in from various sources. The amounts weren't huge, but they were enough to make a real difference in his situation. Actors he had worked with decades earlier, contributed money to help with his expenses. Old friends reached out to offer support. Viewers who had grown up watching him in westerns and war movies sent letters expressing their appreciation for his work. It wasn't the grand Hollywood ending that he truly deserved after his long career, but it was something real and meaningful. It served as a reminder that while the industry itself had turned away from him, the people who had been touched by his work had not forgotten. Through all of this difficult time, Jaeckel remained characteristically humble. He never publicly complained about his situation or lashed out at the system that had ultimately failed to take care of him. If he felt angry about how things had turned out, he never showed it publicly. Instead, he focused on the time he had left, the people who stood by him during his illness, and the substantial body of work he had already given to the world. But this final chapter of his life still raised a deeply unsettling question that many people found disturbing. How could a man who had given so much to Hollywood end up with so little in return? And heartbreakingly, the most silent moment of his entire story was yet to come. Richard Jaeckel spent his final days in a modest room at the Motion Picture and Television Fund home in Woodland Hills, California. He was far away from the movie sets, red carpet premieres, and sound stages that had defined his entire adult life. He faded into the background of an industry that had once relied heavily on his face and his talent to tell some of its most gripping and memorable stories. There were no farewell documentaries produced about his life and career, no special in memoriam programs prepared for prime-time television broadcasts, and no major retrospectives celebrating his contributions to cinema. For many people in the entertainment world, his disappearance from public view was quiet, almost too quiet for someone who had contributed so much over so many years. On June 14, 1997, Richard Jaeckel passed away at the age of 70. The cause of death was cancer, a battle he had fought with courage and without public complaint. His death barely created a ripple in the entertainment world that he had served for more than 5 decades. A few trade publications mentioned his passing in brief articles. A couple of television retrospective programs offered short acknowledgments of his career. But the media, which was always quick to shower elaborate tributes on bigger and more famous names, had very little to say about his death. For a man who had appeared in more than 150 roles, many of them truly memorable and iconic performances, the silence surrounding his death was absolutely deafening. Yet the people who knew him best remember a very different kind of farewell. His sons, Barry and Richard Jr., spoke about a father who never allowed bitterness to take hold in his heart. Despite his serious illness and the financial struggles his family faced, he remained grounded and calm, exactly as he had always been throughout his life and career. He didn't fear the end of his life, and he accepted what was coming with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his career. While his industry may have forgotten about him, his family never did. Neither did the fans who continued to rediscover his work through late-night television reruns and classic film channels that featured the movies he had appeared in. It wasn't just his death that was remarkably quiet. It was the decades leading up to it as well. There were no scandals associated with his name, no Hollywood meltdowns or public breakdowns, and no attention-grabbing interviews where he complained about his treatment. There was just consistent, disciplined, professional work. The kind of work that kept the wheels of the movie industry turning smoothly. The kind that rarely gets celebrated, but always matters tremendously to the final product. Some of the actors who had once shared scenes with him in various productions went on to win multiple prestigious awards, sign multi-million-dollar contracts, and enjoy permanent legacy status in Hollywood history. Meanwhile, Jaeckel left this world without owning a mansion, without accumulating a fortune, and without receiving the full recognition and credit he truly deserved for his contributions. He had been the unsung backbone of countless film and television productions throughout his career, always delivering excellent performances and never demanding special treatment or recognition. In the end, it was that quiet dignity and professionalism that defined him more completely than any newspaper headline could have. His life had not ended in disgrace or controversy, but in something that was perhaps even harder for his loved ones to accept, complete obscurity from the industry he had served so faithfully. For a man who had given absolutely everything he had to his craft and to his work, that obscurity felt almost cruel to those who understood his true value. But his story doesn't end there, because what his life represented and what it revealed about Hollywood's treatment of its forgotten heroes is something that people in the industry are still grappling with today. When people look back on the golden years of American cinema, they usually focus on the major stars, the headline-making celebrities, the box office champions, and the actors whose names are etched into awards and Walk of Fame stars. But the truth is that Hollywood would never have survived or thrived without actors like Richard Jaeckel. He was never the face featured prominently on movie posters, but he was often the actor who made those posters matter to audiences. He brought real weight and importance to action scenes, genuine humanity to war films, and an unshakable sense of realism to stories that might have otherwise felt hollow or unconvincing. He wasn't just a background player filling space in scenes. He was often the soul behind the spectacle, the emotional core that made everything else work effectively. And yet, despite all of that crucial contribution, he was ultimately left behind by the industry. Not because he had failed in any way, but because he had never chased fame in the aggressive way that others did. He didn't engage in Hollywood politics or play the complex games that often determine success in the entertainment business. He didn't hire expensive publicists to create favorable narratives about him or generate headlines through personal drama or controversy. Instead, he simply let his work speak for itself, trusting that quality and consistency would be enough. Unfortunately, in an industry that often forgets those who don't constantly demand attention, his quiet dignity became a double-edged sword that ultimately worked against his long-term recognition. His story raises a difficult and important question about how the entertainment industry values its contributors. Why do some actors achieve immortality while others vanish into historical footnotes? Richard Jaeckel gave 5 full decades of his life to appearing on screens large and small. He delivered an Oscar-nominated performance that demonstrated his exceptional range and ability. He stood shoulder to shoulder with some of the most iconic actors in cinema history. He earned the genuine respect of his fellow performers, his directors, and his audiences around the world. And yet, in the end, his name was missing from most of the major tributes and retrospectives that celebrated the era he had helped define. There were no major Lifetime Achievement Award Diaz recognizing his body of work, no special re-releases of his best films to introduce him to new generations, and no museum exhibitions celebrating his contributions, just a slow, quiet fade into the realm of distant memory. But for those who actually watched him work over the years, for the fans who remember the intensity he brought to every scene, the complete honesty in all of his performances, and the strength he brought to every character he portrayed, Richard Jaeckel remains completely unforgettable. More than that, he serves as a powerful reminder that true greatness in Hollywood isn't always measured by headlines, ticket sales, or award ceremonies. Sometimes real greatness is about consistency, unwavering commitment, and personal integrity. Jaeckel may have died without accumulating riches, without receiving major accolades, and without achieving widespread fame that would have made him a household name. But he left behind something far more enduring and valuable than any of those things, a substantial body of work that continues to speak powerfully for itself, and a legacy that, while too often ignored by the industry, remains permanently etched into the very foundation of American film history. So if you find yourself flipping through television channels someday, and you see him, maybe wearing a military uniform, maybe sitting on horseback, maybe staring down danger with that quiet intensity that made him so compelling, pause for a moment. Take time to appreciate what you're seeing, because that man whose name you might not immediately recognize was truly one of the finest actors to ever practice the craft. Richard Jaeckel never needed a spotlight to shine brightly. All he needed was a camera pointed at him, and he made every single frame count.